Picture this. 1958. Two Minnesota brothers walk into a Caterpillar executive's office carrying blueprints for a compact loader that weighs less than 2,000 pounds. The executive barely glances at the drawings before dismissing them with 4 words that would cost his company billions. Way too small. Next. John Deere's response was equally swift and equally catastrophic. No market for toys. Today, that toy generates over $8 billion annually in a market so completely dominated by Bobcat that Caterpillar and John Deere are still fighting for scraps. This is the story of the greatest miscalculation in industrial history, when the titans of heavy equipment were so blind to innovation that they handed an entire industry to a company that started on a turkey farm. Now, before we continue, I want to know something. Have you ever seen a Bobcat skid steer loader in action? Maybe on a construction site in your neighborhood, or doing landscaping work, or moving materials in tight spaces where big equipment can't fit. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you've noticed just how absolutely everywhere these compact machines are. Because once you know this story, you'll never look at a Bobcat the same way again. Let's roll back to the late 1950s. The construction equipment industry was dominated by massive machines built by massive companies. Caterpillar, fresh off their success building the Panama Canal and winning World War II, was the undisputed king of earth-moving equipment. John Deere controlled agricultural machinery. International Harvester Allis-Chalmers Case. These were the titans whose yellow, green, and red machines defined American industry. And they all shared one unshakable belief. Bigger is better. More horsepower, more weight, more capacity, that was the path to success. The entire industry was locked in a race to build larger and more powerful equipment. The idea that someone would intentionally build something smaller seemed not just wrong, but fundamentally stupid. But out in Rothsay, Minnesota, population 800, 2 brothers named Eddie and Cyril Keller were facing a problem that massive equipment couldn't solve. They weren't industrial visionaries or mechanical engineers with fancy degrees from prestigious universities. They were turkey farmers trying to survive brutal North Dakota winters. Winters where temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, where snow piled so high it buried buildings, where doing the daily work of farming became an exercise in frozen misery. Eddie Keller spent his days shoveling turkey manure in conditions that would make most people quit. The work destroyed his back, exhausted his body, and made him desperate for any solution that could make the brutal labor even slightly more bearable. The Kellers had tried using existing equipment. Small tractors were too big to maneuver in the tight confines of turkey barns. They couldn't turn in narrow spaces, couldn't access cramped areas where work needed to be done, and were fundamentally designed for open fields, not confined agricultural operations. Manual labor was the only option, and it was killing them. Eddie Keller, his back aching from another day of impossible work, started sketching ideas for something different. Something compact enough to work in tight spaces but powerful enough to actually do meaningful work. Something that could turn on its own axis, that could fit through standard doorways, that could maneuver in spaces where traditional equipment was useless. He had no idea he was designing the future of an $8 billion industry. He just wanted to stop destroying his body shoveling turkey waste. The brothers built their first prototype in 1958, and it was absolutely ridiculous. A 3-wheeled machine that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and wishful thinking, because it had a single rear wheel for steering and 2 front wheels for drive, creating a design that was fundamentally unstable. The thing tipped over constantly. It broke down repeatedly. Workers who tried it were skeptical at best, hostile at worst. But the Kellers were farmers, not quitters, and farmers don't give up when the first attempt fails. They kept testing, kept modifying, kept learning from each failure. And slowly, painfully, they started to figure something out. The problem wasn't the concept, it was the execution. By 1959, the Kellers had developed a better design. A 4-wheeled machine with a revolutionary steering mechanism. Instead of turning the wheels, the machine used differential power to the left and right wheels, making them rotate at different speeds. This created something unprecedented. A machine that could literally spin in place, turning within its own footprint. They called it skid steering because the wheels would skid sideways during turns. It was mechanically simple, brilliantly effective, and unlike anything else in the equipment industry. The Keller brothers had invented a completely new category of machine, and they knew they'd created something special. What they didn't know was that the giants they approached would be too arrogant to see its potential. The rejection from Caterpillar and John Deere wasn't polite corporate diplomacy. It was dismissive, condescending, and absolute. Executives who ran companies worth hundreds of millions looked at a compact loader that weighed less than a ton and saw a toy, a novelty, a waste of time. Their engineering departments were focused on building 200-ton mining trucks and 500-horsepower tractors. The idea that there was a massive market for small equipment seemed absurd. Who would buy this? They asked. What could it possibly do that our real equipment can't do better? The Kellers tried to explain. Tight spaces, maneuverability, versatility, lower cost. The executives weren't interested. They had an industry to dominate with massive machines, and they weren't going to waste resources on something so obviously insignificant. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where the giants made their trillion-dollar mistake. The Keller brothers didn't give up. They couldn't afford to. They'd invested everything in their invention, and they believed in it with the desperate certainty of people who had actually used the machine and knew it worked. So they kept looking for someone who would listen, someone who could see past industry assumptions to the revolutionary potential of compact equipment. And they found them. The Melro brothers, manufacturers in Gwinner, North Dakota, who ran a company making agricultural equipment and were willing to take a chance on something different. The partnership between the Kellers and the Melro Manufacturing Company created the Melro Bobcat, and what happened next was the industrial equivalent of David obliterating Goliath with a slingshot. The compact loader started selling not just to turkey farmers but to contractors, landscapers, warehouse operators, anyone who needed to move material in confined spaces. The machines could fit through standard doorways, work in basements, maneuver on job sites where big equipment was useless, and cost a fraction of what traditional loaders cost. The market that Caterpillar and John Deere said didn't exist was exploding, and Bobcat owned all of it. And the irony? The cruel, poetic, utterly devastating irony? By the time Caterpillar and John Deere realized their mistake and tried to enter the compact equipment market, Bobcat had spent 20 years perfecting the technology, building dealer networks, establishing the brand, and completely dominating the space. The giants could build competing machines, and they eventually did, but they could never reclaim the market they'd handed to Bobcat through sheer arrogance. That dismissive, too small comment in 1958 cost the industry titans billions of dollars and created a competitor they can never fully defeat. Every yellow Caterpillar compact loader you see today is a machine they should have built 20 years earlier, sold in a market they should have owned, generating revenue that should have been theirs. Instead, it all went to the company that started because two turkey farmers refused to accept that their backs had to break. Eddie and Cyril Keller weren't supposed to change industrial history. They had no engineering degrees from prestigious universities, no connections to manufacturing giants, no venture capital funding their dreams. They were turkey farmers in Rothsay, Minnesota, a town so small that calling it a town was generous. Population 800 on a good day, surrounded by endless farmland that stretched to horizons broken only by grain elevators and the occasional church steeple. This was farming country, where success meant surviving another season, and innovation meant figuring out a better way to fix a broken tractor with baling wire and determination. The Keller brothers were good at that kind of innovation, the desperate, practical kind born from necessity rather than ambition. To understand how Bobcat was born, you need to understand what winter means in that part of America. We're not talking about inconvenient snow or cold mornings that require an extra jacket. We're talking about temperatures that regularly dropped to 30 below zero Fahrenheit before wind chill. Temperatures where exposed skin freezes in minutes, where diesel fuel turns to gel, where steel becomes so brittle it snaps like glass. The wind that screamed across those flat plains didn't just make it colder. It made it dangerous, driving the wind chill to 50 and 60 below. People died in those winters. Farmers caught between barn and house, travelers stranded on rural roads, workers who made one mistake and paid with frostbite or worse. The Keller brothers raised turkeys, which meant their work didn't stop when winter arrived. Turkeys need feeding every single day, regardless of temperature. The barns need cleaning constantly because thousands of birds produce mountains of waste that has to be removed or disease spreads and the entire flock dies. In summer, this work was merely unpleasant. In winter, it became brutal punishment that destroyed bodies and broke spirits. Eddie Keller, the older brother, handled most of the heavy labor. Every morning, he would bundle up in layers that made movement difficult, trudge through snowdrifts to the turkey barns, and begin the Sisyphean task of shoveling manure in sub-zero temperatures. His back screamed with every shovelful. His hands, even in heavy gloves, went numb within minutes. His lungs burned from breathing air so cold it felt like inhaling knives. By the mid-1950s, Eddie Keller's back was giving out. Not gradually, catastrophically. Herniated discs, muscle damage, chronic pain that made sleep impossible and work agony. He was in his 30s, supposedly in his prime, but his body was breaking down like he was 20 years older. Doctors told him what doctors always told farmers: stop doing the heavy labor or risk permanent disability. But farmers can't just stop working. There were no turkey farm managers they could hire, no workers lining up for the privilege of shoveling frozen manure for minimum wage. The Keller brothers did the work themselves or the farm failed, the flock died, and they lost everything. Quitting wasn't an option. Finding another way was the only option. The brothers tried using existing equipment to reduce the manual labor. They had a small tractor, most farms did, but it was designed for field work, not barn work. The thing was too wide to fit through barn doors. Couldn't turn in the narrow aisles between turkey pens. Its turning radius required space they didn't have. They tried using a wheelbarrow and a small cart, but that still meant shoveling by hand, loading by hand, pushing by hand. Every solution still resulted in Eddie's back screaming and his body paying the price. They needed something that didn't exist. A machine small enough to work in confined spaces, but strong enough to move heavy loads. Maneuverable enough to navigate tight corners, but stable enough not to tip over constantly. Eddie started sketching ideas in the evenings, hunched over kitchen tables with pencils and paper, drawing machines that he hoped might work. He wasn't trained in mechanical engineering or industrial design. Everything he knew came from maintaining farm equipment, from watching machines work and understanding intuitively how forces and mechanisms functioned. His drawings were crude but showed genuine mechanical insight, ideas about weight distribution, power application, steering mechanisms. Cyril, the younger brother, was more skeptical but willing to help. If Eddie thought something might work, they'd try to build it. They had a small workshop, basic welding equipment, and the accumulated mechanical knowledge that came from decades of fixing their own equipment because professional repair was too expensive or too far away. The big innovation, the idea that would eventually become Bobcat, came from watching how their current equipment failed in barn spaces. Traditional tractors steered by turning the front wheels, which required a wide turning radius. The tighter you needed to turn, the more space you required, and barn aisles offered almost no space at all. But what if you eliminated wheel steering entirely? What if, instead of turning wheels to change direction, you varied the power to the left and right sides of the machine? If the left wheels turned faster than the right wheels, the machine would curve right. If you reversed the left side while powering the right side forward, the machine would spin in place. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it would require building something completely different from any existing tractor design. The brothers started scrounging parts. Farming communities in the 1950s were experts at salvage and repurposing. You didn't throw away anything that might be useful later. Old tractor components, salvaged engines, wheels from broken equipment, steel stock from a local supplier. They worked through the winter of 1957 into 1958, building their first prototype in whatever time they could spare from the relentless demands of the turkey farm. Money was tight, farm income was never generous, and building an experimental machine meant spending money they could barely afford to lose. But Eddie's back was getting worse, and desperation is a powerful motivator. They needed this to work, not for glory or profit, but because the alternative was Eddie becoming permanently disabled. The first machine they built was a disaster. 3 wheels, 2 in front for drive, 1 in back for steering, because 3 wheels required less complex engineering than 4. It was small, fitting through a standard barn door. It had a small gasoline engine salvaged from another piece of equipment. It had a simple loader bucket welded to the front. And it tipped over constantly because 3-wheel designs are inherently unstable, especially when the front wheels are doing the driving and the load is also at the front. Workers who tried it hated it. The thing was dangerous, unreliable, and seemed to prove that the entire concept was flawed. Most people would have quit. The Keller brothers, with farmer stubbornness, kept going. They rebuilt it with 4 wheels, creating a more stable platform. They experimented with the loader design, changing how weight was distributed. They modified the steering mechanism, refining how differential power was applied to create turns. Each iteration was expensive, time-consuming, and exhausting, done in whatever hours they could steal from farming. The turkey farm still needed running. Eddie's back still hurt constantly. Money was still tight. But slowly, painfully, the machine started working. Not perfectly, far from it, but well enough that they could see the potential. Could fit through barn doors. It could turn in spaces where traditional tractors were helpless. It could lift and move loads that would have required hours of manual labor. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't refined, but it solved their problem. By late 1958, the Keller brothers had a working prototype of what would become the skid-steer loader. They had invented a completely new category of equipment, not through industrial research programs or corporate development budgets, but through desperate necessity and farmer ingenuity. They didn't know they'd created an $8 billion industry. They didn't know they'd revolutionized construction, landscaping, and agriculture worldwide. They just knew they'd solved their problem, and they thought maybe, just maybe, other people had similar problems that this little machine could solve. All they needed was someone to help them manufacture and sell it. Surely, they thought, the big equipment companies would see the potential and want to partner with them. They had no idea how catastrophically wrong that assumption would be. The first prototype that rolled out of the Keller brothers' workshop in early 1958 looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never seen a tractor before. 3 wheels, a tiny gasoline engine, a crude loader bucket welded to a frame that appeared to be held together by determination and questionable welds. When Eddie Keller fired it up for the first time and attempted to drive it across the yard, it made it approximately 15 feet before tipping sideways and dumping him onto frozen ground. Cyril, watching from the workshop door, didn't laugh. Mostly because he'd spent 3 months helping build the thing, and laughter would have been admitting they'd wasted time and money they couldn't afford to waste. Instead, he walked over, helped Eddie up, and said the words that would define the next year of their lives. "Well, let's figure out what went wrong." The 3-wheel design had seemed logical on paper. 3 points define a plane, creating inherent stability. It required less complex engineering than a 4-wheel design, fewer drive components, simpler power transmission, easier steering mechanism. Most importantly for the cash-strapped Keller brothers, it was cheaper to build. They'd positioned 2 wheels in front, powered by the engine, with a single rear wheel for steering like a massive tricycle. The loader bucket was mounted at the front, extending forward from the frame. In theory, this should have worked. In practice, physics had other ideas. Every time the bucket lifted a load, the weight shifted forward. Every time the machine turned, centrifugal force pushed sideways. The combination made the thing tip over with alarming frequency and spectacular results. But here's what's remarkable about the Keller brothers. They didn't quit. Farmers don't have the luxury of quitting when something doesn't work the first time. Your tractor breaks down in the middle of harvest, you don't call for a new tractor. You fix it with whatever tools and parts you have available, because the crops won't wait. That same mentality applied to their experimental machine. Tipped over? Figure out why and fix it. The engine stalled constantly? Adjust the carburetor and try again. The loader bucket's hydraulics leaked? Repair the seals and test it again. Every failure was just information about what didn't work, bringing them closer to understanding what would work. Through the brutal winter of 1958, they tested, failed, modified, and tested again. The workshop where they worked was barely heated. a small wood stove that kept the temperature just above freezing, which felt tropical compared to outside but was still cold enough that welding with numb fingers was dangerous. They worked in the evenings after the turkey farm duties were finished, often until midnight or later, driven by a combination of desperation and obsession. Eddie's back pain provided constant motivation. Every day spent shoveling manure was another reminder of why they needed this machine to work. They kept detailed notes, sketching modifications and recording results. When the three-wheel design proved fundamentally unstable, they didn't abandon the concept. They recognized that the problem was the wheel configuration, not the overall approach. By spring of 1958, they'd rebuilt the machine with 4 wheels, creating a rectangular platform that was inherently more stable. But this created a new problem: steering. Traditional tractors steered by turning the front wheels, which worked fine for field operations but required turning radius that tight spaces didn't provide. The Kellers had already recognized this limitation. That's why they'd started experimenting in the first place. The solution they developed was radical, inspired partly by watching how tracked vehicles like Caterpillar tractors turned. Tracks could turn by driving one side forward and the other backward, allowing the vehicle to pivot in place. Could wheels do something similar? The mechanism they created used independent power control to the left and right wheels. In straight operation, all 4 wheels received equal power and turned at the same speed. To turn right, the left wheels would speed up while the right wheels slowed down or reversed, causing the machine to pivot around a central point. To turn left, the opposite happened. The wheels didn't steer, they skidded sideways during the turn, which is why they eventually called it skid steering. It was mechanically simpler than traditional steering linkages, required no complex front axle design, and created something unprecedented: a machine that could literally spin in place, turning within its own footprint. The maneuverability was revolutionary, even if the early implementation was crude and unreliable. But revolutionary doesn't mean it worked well, at least not initially. The skid steer mechanism put enormous stress on the drivetrain. Chains broke constantly, gears stripped under load. The hydraulic system for the loader bucket leaked, failed, and generally behaved like it was designed to frustrate rather than function. The engine, salvaged from other equipment, was underpowered and temperamental. Workers they convinced to test it, farm hands and neighbors who owed them favors, were universally skeptical. "This thing's gonna kill somebody," was a common assessment. "Why don't you just buy a real tractor?" was another frequent suggestion, usually delivered with the kind of pity reserved for people attempting obviously impossible tasks. The brothers kept refining through 1958 and into 1959. They reinforced the frame to handle the stresses of skid steering. They upgraded to a more powerful engine purchased new, which was a significant financial risk but necessary for the machine to have enough power for actual work. They completely redesigned the hydraulic system for the loader, moving from salvaged components to properly engineered parts. Each improvement cost money they didn't have and time they could barely spare from farming. Eddie's wife questioned whether they were throwing good money after bad. Cyril had moments of doubt, wondering if the skeptics were right and they were wasting effort on something that would never work commercially even if they got it functioning. But then something changed. By late 1959, the machine actually started working reliably. Not perfectly, there were still issues with durability, with component failures, with systems that needed further refinement. But it could drive into a turkey barn, maneuver in spaces where traditional tractors were helpless, lift and move loads that would have required hours of manual labor, and do it day after day without catastrophic failures. Eddie used it for the turkey farm work, and for the first time in years, his back started to improve. He wasn't shoveling constantly. He wasn't destroying his body. The machine was doing the work, and it was doing it in a way that nothing else could match. The concept wasn't just valid, it was transformative. The Kellers started showing their machine to other farmers, to local contractors, to anyone who might have similar problems with working in confined spaces. The response was remarkable. People who saw it work immediately understood the potential. "I could use that in my dairy barn. That would be perfect for loading trucks in my warehouse. Can you build me one?" The demand was there, waiting to be tapped. But the Keller brothers weren't manufacturers. They were turkey farmers with one experimental machine built in a workshop with basic tools. They needed a manufacturing partner, someone with the facilities, expertise, and capital to turn their prototype into a commercial product. They needed someone like Caterpillar or John Deere, companies with the resources to recognize innovation and bring it to market. They had no idea that approaching those giants would result in the most expensive rejection in industrial history. Eddie Keller walked into the Caterpillar regional office in early 1960 carrying blueprints, photographs, and the unshakable conviction that he was about to change both their lives. He'd spent weeks preparing for this meeting, practicing his pitch, anticipating questions, gathering documentation that proved his compact loader wasn't just a working prototype, but a revolutionary product with massive commercial potential. Caterpillar was the king of construction equipment, the company that had built the Panama Canal and won World War II with their tracked vehicles. If anyone would recognize the value of innovative equipment, it would be them. The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. The Caterpillar executive barely looked at the blueprints before delivering a rejection so swift and dismissive it took Eddie's breath away. Way too small. We build real equipment. Next. To understand the magnitude of this mistake, you need to understand Caterpillar's mindset in 1960. The company was riding high on decades of success built on a simple philosophy. Bigger is better. Their smallest tractor weighed several tons. Their largest mining trucks weighed hundreds of tons and could move mountains of earth. The entire construction equipment industry shared this belief, that power came from size, that capability required mass, that success meant building ever larger machines. Caterpillar's engineering department was focused on developing 200-ton haul trucks and 500-horsepower dozers. Their marketing department sold the image of unstoppable yellow giants conquering impossible terrain. Their entire corporate identity was built on being the biggest, strongest, most powerful equipment manufacturer on Earth. When Eddie Keller showed them a compact loader that weighed less than 2,000 pounds, every assumption Caterpillar held told them it was worthless. The machine was too small to do real work. It was too light to have meaningful capacity. It was designed for confined spaces, but Caterpillar's equipment was designed to create space by moving earth and demolishing obstacles. The executive who dismissed Eddie wasn't being malicious or particularly arrogant by the standards of the era. He was applying conventional wisdom that had served the company brilliantly for 50 years. Small equipment was a toy market, beneath the dignity of a company that built machines for serious work. The idea that there might be a massive market for compact equipment simply didn't compute. It violated everything they believed about their industry. The rejection from John Deere was equally swift but came with a different flavor of condescension. John Deere dominated agricultural equipment, and they saw themselves as practical, no-nonsense manufacturers who understood what farmers actually needed. When the Kellers approached them with their compact loader, the response was polite but absolute. There's no market for something like that. Farmers need real tractors, not toys. If this had commercial potential, we'd already be building it. The circular logic was impeccable. If compact loaders were valuable, John Deere would already be making them. Since John Deere wasn't making them, they obviously weren't valuable. The executive suggested the Kellers focus on improving their turkey farming operation and leave equipment manufacturing to professionals who understood the market. What makes these rejections particularly devastating in retrospect is how close the Kellers came to giving up. They weren't wealthy men with unlimited resources to fund their invention. They were farmers who had invested everything they could afford, and some they couldn't afford, into developing their prototype. The rejections from Caterpillar and John Deere weren't just disappointing. They were financially catastrophic. These were the industry leaders, the companies with the expertise and market knowledge that small inventors lacked. If they said there was no market, maybe there wasn't. Eddie's wife urged him to cut their losses and focus on the farm. Cyril was ready to dismantle the prototype and salvage what they could from the parts. The dream was dying, killed not by technical failure but by the industry's absolute certainty that it knew best. But the Kellers had one advantage that Caterpillar and John Deere lacked. They'd actually used their machine for real work. They knew, with the concrete certainty that comes from daily experience, that the compact loader solved real problems that existing equipment couldn't touch. They'd watched it work in spaces where traditional tractors were useless. They'd received enthusiastic responses from every farmer, contractor, and warehouse operator who'd seen it in action. The market existed, they'd seen it firsthand. The giants were wrong, and proving them wrong became Eddie Keller's obsession. He started contacting smaller manufacturers, companies that might be more willing to take risks that the established giants avoided. International Harvester gave them a slightly longer meeting, 20 minutes instead of 12, but the conclusion was identical. Interesting concept, but there's no market at scale. Maybe you could sell a few dozen to specialty operations, but that's not worth our manufacturing capacity. Alice Chalmers was more blunt. We're not interested in novelty items. Case politely explained that their product development pipeline was focused on larger, more powerful equipment because that's what customers were demanding. Every major manufacturer in the industry looked at the compact loader and saw the same thing. A solution searching for a problem that didn't exist, built by amateurs who didn't understand the equipment business. The rejection was universal, complete, and utterly confident. Here's what the giants missed, what their size and success blinded them to. They were all designing equipment for the work they currently understood, not for work that could exist if the right equipment was available. Caterpillar built massive earth-moving equipment because moving massive amounts of earth was valuable. But what about the contractor who needed to excavate a basement in an existing building? What about the landscaper working in residential areas where big equipment couldn't access the site? What about the warehouse operator moving materials in tight spaces? What about the farmer working in dairy barns or poultry operations? These weren't markets that existed for traditional equipment because traditional equipment couldn't serve them. The Kellers weren't asking the giants to enter an existing market. They were showing them a new market that would only exist if compact equipment was available. The irony that makes this story almost painful is that some engineers at these companies recognized the potential. Junior designers at Caterpillar who saw the Keller blueprints understood that the skid steer mechanism was brilliant. Product managers at John Deere recognized that there might be niche applications for compact equipment. But corporate decision-making at large companies doesn't work through individual insight. It works through consensus and risk assessment. Every analysis of the compact loader market came back with the same conclusion. Unproven concept, uncertain demand, small potential revenue, not strategic priority. In a company generating hundreds of millions in revenue from proven products, why waste resources on something so speculative? The financial calculations seemed to support the rejections. If the compact equipment market generated $10 million annually, which seemed optimistic, and Caterpillar captured half of it, that would add $5 million to their revenue. For a company already generating over $500 million annually, $5 million was a rounding error, not worth the engineering resources and manufacturing capacity required. The analysis was logical, professional, and completely wrong, because the market wasn't $10 million. It wasn't $50 million. It was $8 billion waiting to explode the moment someone built the equipment to serve it. But you can't see markets that don't exist yet, especially when you're too successful to question your assumptions. By late 1960, the Keller brothers had been rejected by every major equipment manufacturer in America. They'd exhausted their list of potential partners. Their savings were gone. The prototype sat in their workshop, a testament to innovation that the industry insisted nobody wanted. Most inventors would have quit. But the Kellers were farmers, and farmers are constitutionally incapable of admitting defeat when they know they're right. So they kept looking for someone, anyone, who could see what the giants were blind to. And in Gwinner, North Dakota, they found them. The Melro Manufacturing Company in Gwinner, North Dakota, wasn't an obvious candidate to revolutionize the construction equipment industry. They made agricultural equipment, windrow pickup attachments, mostly devices that gathered cut crops into rows for easier processing. It was specialized, unglamorous work serving a small market that the major manufacturers considered too niche to bother with. But the Melro brothers, Cliff, Irv, Les, and Roger, had built their business by identifying problems that others ignored and creating practical solutions. When Eddie and Cyril Keller showed up at their facility in late 1960 with a compact loader prototype and a story about being rejected by every major manufacturer in America, the Melrose didn't dismiss them. They listened, and more importantly, they understood. Cliff Melrose, the eldest brother and company president, looked at the Keller prototype with an engineer's eye. The machine was crude, clearly built in a farm workshop with limited resources. The welds were rough, the hydraulics were basic, the whole thing had the improvised quality of equipment assembled from salvaged parts and determination. But Cliff saw past the rough execution to the fundamental innovation. The skid steer mechanism was brilliant. The compact size opened applications that traditional equipment couldn't touch, and the maneuverability was unlike anything in the industry. He asked Eddie to demonstrate the machine, and what he saw convinced him. The loader spun in place, turned in impossibly tight spaces, lifted loads efficiently despite its small size. This wasn't a toy. This was a new category of equipment. The Melrose brothers faced a decision that Caterpillar and John Deere had dismissed without serious consideration. Was there really a market for compact equipment? Or were the Kellers delusional turkey farmers chasing a fantasy? The conventional wisdom said no market existed. Every major manufacturer had concluded that small equipment was commercially unviable. But the Melrose had built their business by ignoring conventional wisdom when their own observations contradicted it. They talked to contractors, farmers, warehouse operators, and landscapers. They asked a simple question. If equipment existed that could work in tight spaces, maneuver in confined areas, and cost significantly less than traditional loaders, would you buy it? The response was overwhelmingly positive. The market existed, it just hadn't been served because nobody built the right equipment. In early 1960, the Melrose brothers signed a licensing agreement with the Keller brothers. Melrose Manufacturing would handle production, marketing, and sales. The Kellers would receive royalties on every unit sold and continue providing input on design improvements. It was a partnership born from mutual necessity and shared vision. The Kellers needed manufacturing capability they didn't have, and the Melrose needed innovative products to expand beyond their agricultural niche. They named the machine the Melrose Bobcat, choosing the Bobcat as a symbol because the animal was small, fierce, agile, and capable of taking on challenges far larger than itself. The metaphor was more perfect than they realized. They were about to take on the industrial giants with equipment a fraction of the size. The first production Bobcat M400 rolled off the Melrose assembly line in 1960. It was significantly more refined than the Keller prototype. Professional manufacturing replaced farm workshop construction, engineered components replaced salvaged parts, and systematic testing ensured reliability that the prototype had never achieved. But the fundamental innovations remained. Skid steer operation, compact dimensions, remarkable maneuverability, and the ability to work in spaces where traditional equipment was useless. The machine weighed 1,800 pounds, had a 25 horsepower engine, and could lift roughly 1,000 pounds. By traditional equipment standards, these were laughable specifications. By the standards of what it could accomplish in confined spaces, they were revolutionary. The early sales strategy was necessarily grassroots. Melrose couldn't afford massive advertising campaigns or nationwide dealer networks. They targeted local contractors, farmers, and small businesses within driving distance of North Dakota. They offered demonstrations, letting potential customers actually use the equipment to solve their specific problems. This hands-on approach proved devastatingly effective because once someone operated a Bobcat, they immediately understood its value. A contractor excavating a basement in an existing building could bring the Bobcat through a standard doorway and work inside. A landscaper could maneuver in residential yards where big equipment would destroy lawns and driveways. A dairy farmer could clean barns with equipment that actually fit through barn doors. Every demonstration generated sales because the machine solved real problems that potential customers faced daily. The response from the first customers was enthusiasm bordering on evangelical. These weren't people who'd been convinced to try something new through slick marketing. These were contractors and farmers who'd struggled for years with problems that suddenly had solutions. Word spread through the construction and agricultural communities faster than any advertising campaign could have achieved. "You gotta see this thing" became the most common recommendation. By late 1960, Melrose was struggling to keep up with demand. They'd projected selling maybe 50 units the first year. They sold hundreds. The compact equipment market that Caterpillar and John Deere insisted didn't exist was exploding, and Bobcat owned all of it. The applications for compact loaders expanded faster than Melrose had anticipated. Contractors used them for construction, excavation, grading, and material handling. Farmers used them for barn cleaning, feed handling, and general farm work. Landscapers used them for site preparation, grading, and material placement. Warehouses used them for loading, unloading, and organizing inventory. Municipalities used them for maintenance, snow removal, and utility work. The versatility of the compact loader, enhanced by the skid steer mechanism that made attachments easy to swap, meant that a single machine could serve multiple purposes. Customers who bought one Bobcat often bought 2 or 3 more once they discovered how many different tasks the equipment could handle. By 1962, Bobcat was no longer a regional manufacturer selling a novelty product. They were becoming a national brand serving a rapidly expanding market. Melrose established dealer networks across the United States, training salespeople and service technicians on equipment that was fundamentally different from traditional loaders. The distinctive white color of early Bobcats, chosen partly for visibility and partly to differentiate from Caterpillar's yellow and John Deere's green, became synonymous with compact equipment. The company that Caterpillar had dismissed as irrelevant was generating millions in revenue from a market that supposedly didn't exist. And the growth was accelerating, not slowing. The success of Bobcat validated everything the Keller brothers had believed and everything the giants had dismissed. The compact equipment market wasn't a niche, it was enormous, touching virtually every industry that moved materials or excavated earth. The machines weren't toys, they were highly capable equipment perfectly sized for the work they were designed to do. The manufacturers who'd rejected the Kellers weren't visionaries who understood the market. They were hidebound by assumptions that prevented them from seeing opportunity. And by the time Caterpillar and John Deere finally recognized their mistake, Bobcat had a lead measured in years of development, thousands of satisfied customers, and complete market dominance. The compact revolution had arrived, and the giants who should have led it were left scrambling to catch up to the turkey farmers they dismissed as amateurs. Through the 1960s, something remarkable happened that drove Caterpillar executives to private fits of rage. Bobcat became synonymous with compact equipment the same way Caterpillar had become synonymous with earth-moving. When contractors needed a compact loader, they didn't ask for a skid steer, they asked for a Bobcat, even if they ended up buying a different brand. When equipment rental companies stocked their yards, Bobcat was the default choice because that's what customers requested by name. The brand recognition that usually took decades to build and required millions in advertising happened organically for Bobcat because they'd created an entirely new category of equipment and owned it completely. Meanwhile, Caterpillar and John Deere were still building bigger tractors and bigger loaders, congratulating themselves on quarterly earnings, completely unaware that a market worth billions was being built without them. Melrose didn't just manufacture equipment, they created an ecosystem around compact loaders that made competing almost impossible. They established a dealer network specifically trained on skid steer equipment, teaching salespeople and mechanics the unique characteristics of machines that operated fundamentally differently from traditional loaders. They developed a wide range of attachments: buckets, forks, augers, breakers, snowblowers, that transformed the basic loader into a multi-purpose tool capable of dozens of different tasks. They published training materials, service manuals, and operator guides that educated the market on how to maximize compact equipment capabilities. By the time competitors finally entered the market, they weren't just competing with a product, they were competing with an entire support infrastructure that Bobcat had spent years perfecting. The product line expanded rapidly through the 60s and 70s. The original M400 was joined by larger models with more capacity, smaller models for even tighter spaces, and specialized versions for specific industries. Bobcat introduced the first compact excavator to the North American market in the early 70s. extending their dominance from loaders to another equipment category. Each new product followed the same philosophy: build it compact, make it maneuverable, ensure it can work where traditional equipment fails. The engineering wasn't about raw power, it was about capability in confined spaces, and Bobcat understood this better than anyone because they'd invented the category. Their designs were purpose-built for the work, not scaled-down versions of larger equipment. By the early 1970s, Caterpillar's leadership finally recognized the magnitude of their mistake. The compact equipment market was generating hundreds of millions in annual revenue and growing exponentially. Bobcat controlled approximately 70% market share, with the remaining 30% split among several smaller manufacturers who'd entered the space after seeing Bobcat's success. Caterpillar convened emergency strategy meetings to discuss how they'd missed this opportunity and how to reclaim it. The conclusion was humbling. They'd been so focused on their traditional markets and so committed to their bigger is better philosophy that they'd completely missed a revolution happening in their own industry. The turkey farmers they dismissed in 1960 had built an empire while Caterpillar watched from the sidelines. Caterpillar launched their compact equipment division in the mid-70s, investing heavily in development and marketing. John Deere followed shortly after. Both companies brought substantial resources, engineering expertise, manufacturing capacity, established dealer networks, brand recognition. On paper, they should have been able to compete effectively and reclaim market share from Bobcat. In practice, they discovered that entering an established market is vastly more difficult than creating a new one. Bobcat had defined what compact equipment should be, how it should operate, what features mattered. Customers compared Caterpillar and John Deere offerings not to abstract standards but to Bobcat equipment they'd been using successfully for years. Meeting Bobcat's capabilities was difficult. Exceeding them was nearly impossible. The timing of the giant's entry reveals how completely they misunderstood the compact equipment market initially. Caterpillar introduced their first skid-steer loader in 1977, 17 years after Bobcat's first production unit. John Deere entered in 1975, 15 years late. Those weren't just lost years. They were years when Bobcat was establishing customer relationships, refining designs based on field experience, building brand loyalty, and creating the dealer and service infrastructure that made customers choose Bobcat even when alternatives existed. The giants were trying to catch a train that had left the station nearly 2 decades earlier, and the gap kept widening despite their desperate efforts to close it. The competitive dynamic became almost comical. Caterpillar and John Deere would introduce features they claimed were innovations, only to discover that Bobcat had implemented them years earlier. Improved hydraulics? Bobcat had refined those through the 60s. Better operator controls? Bobcat's ergonomic designs were industry-leading. Attachment versatility? Bobcat's quick-attach system was the de facto standard. The giants were playing catch-up in a market where Bobcat had been the teacher, the innovator, and the standard setter for 15 years. Every new feature from Caterpillar or John Deere was met with knowing smiles from Bobcat dealers who could point out that their equipment had offered that capability since the previous decade. Bobcat's brand identity became powerfully associated with the underdog triumphing over giants, because that's exactly what had happened. Marketing materials emphasized the company's origins with Minnesota turkey farmers who'd been rejected by every major manufacturer. Sales presentations highlighted how Caterpillar and John Deere had dismissed compact equipment as having no market, only to enter the market years late after Bobcat proved them wrong. Customers loved this narrative because it aligned with their own experiences. Small businesses and independent contractors using compact equipment that the big companies had insisted wasn't necessary. Buying a Bobcat wasn't just purchasing equipment. It was choosing the innovative underdog over the arrogant giants who'd missed the revolution. The financial impact of missing the compact equipment market was staggering for Caterpillar and John Deere. Conservative estimates suggest that if Caterpillar had partnered with the Keller brothers in 1960 instead of dismissing them, the compact equipment division would have generated over $2 billion in cumulative revenue through the 70s alone. John Deere's missed opportunity was similarly massive, but the financial cost was actually less significant than the strategic cost. Both companies had surrendered an entire equipment category to a competitor, fragmenting their market dominance and creating a situation where Bobcat competed with them across multiple segments. The decision that had seemed so obviously correct in 1960, dismissing compact equipment as commercially unviable, had created a formidable competitor that would challenge them for decades. Through the 70s and into the 80s, Bobcat continued expanding while Caterpillar and John Deere played catch-up. New models, new attachments, new markets, new applications, Bobcat led and competitors followed. The company that had started in a North Dakota manufacturing facility making agricultural attachments had become a global force in construction equipment, with distribution spanning multiple continents and revenues exceeding hundreds of millions annually. Eddie and Cyril Keller, the turkey farmers who'd been told their machine was too small to matter, were collecting royalties on every unit sold. The Melrose brothers had built a manufacturing empire, and Caterpillar executives were explaining to shareholders how they'd missed a multi-billion-dollar market that had been demonstrated to them in 1960. Today, the global compact equipment market generates over $8 billion in annual revenue. $8 billion. That's not a typo, not an exaggeration, not a projection. That's the actual size of the market that Caterpillar and John Deere executives dismissed as commercially unviable in 1960. To put that in perspective, $8 billion exceeds the entire annual revenue of many Fortune 500 companies. It's more than the GDP of some small nations. And Bobcat, the company that started because two turkey farmers refused to accept that their backs had to break, controls the largest share of that market. Every single day, somewhere on Earth, a construction company chooses a Bobcat over a Caterpillar compact loader, and that choice is a reminder of the most expensive rejection in industrial history. Walk onto any construction site in any major city worldwide and you'll see them. Compact loaders with the distinctive Bobcat logo, maneuvering in spaces where traditional equipment can't fit, doing work that was impossible before 1960. They're excavating basements in existing buildings, working on urban renovation projects where space is measured in feet rather than acres, moving materials through standard doorways, operating in residential neighborhoods where homeowners would never allow massive yellow Caterpillar machines. The applications that Caterpillar insisted didn't exist are now fundamental to modern construction. The market that John Deere said was too small to matter is now essential to how buildings are built, how landscapes are shaped, how infrastructure is maintained across the developed world. Bobcat's market share in compact equipment hovers around 40 to 45% globally, not as dominant as their 70% in the early days, but still the clear market leader decades after competitors entered the space. Caterpillar's compact equipment division captures maybe 15 to 20%. John Deere holds a similar share. Various other manufacturers, Kubota, Case, JCB, and others, split the remainder. But here's the crucial point. Bobcat's 45% of an $8 billion market generates over $3.5 billion annually. Caterpillar's compact division, entering the market 17 years late, generates maybe $1.5 billion. The turkey farmers who were dismissed as amateurs are beating the industrial titan that built the Panama Canal. The irony is so perfect it almost seems fictional. The financial calculations that seemed so logical in 1960, that compact equipment was too small to matter, that the market wasn't worth Caterpillar's resources, have aged like milk left in the sun. If Caterpillar had partnered with the Keller brothers instead of dismissing them, if they'd controlled even 50% of the compact equipment market through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the cumulative revenue would exceed $50 billion. $50 billion in sales that went to competitors because an executive spent 12 minutes looking at blueprints before saying, way too small. Business schools now teach the Bobcat case study as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dismissing innovation that doesn't fit existing assumptions. The Harvard Business Review published multiple articles analyzing how industry leaders missed an entire market category. The rejection that seemed obviously correct in 1960 is now recognized as one of the worst strategic mistakes in modern business history. But the story isn't just about money. It's about how fundamentally Bobcat changed construction, landscaping, agriculture, and facility maintenance. Before compact equipment existed, certain jobs were simply too difficult or expensive to attempt. Excavating a basement in an existing building required demolishing walls to get equipment inside, or doing the work manually at enormous labor cost. Landscaping residential properties meant working around the limitations of equipment that couldn't fit through gates or navigate tight spaces. Warehouse operations meant manual labor for moving materials in areas where forklifts couldn't operate. Bobcat didn't just create a market, they created capabilities that enabled work that would have been impossible otherwise. The compact revolution literally changed what humans could build and how efficiently they could build it. The equipment has evolved dramatically from Eddie Keller's crude prototype. Modern Bobcat loaders feature computer controls, GPS guidance, telematic systems that upload performance data to the cloud, ergonomic operator stations that would seem like fiction to the Keller brothers, and engineering refinement that represents decades of continuous improvement. But the fundamental innovation remains unchanged. Skid-steer operation enabling unprecedented maneuverability, compact dimensions allowing work in confined spaces, and versatility through interchangeable attachments. The technology has been refined, enhanced, and digitized, but the core concept that Caterpillar dismissed as worthless in 1960 is still the foundation of an $8 billion industry. Caterpillar's compact equipment today is actually quite good. They eventually learned from their mistakes, invested heavily in development, and built machines that compete effectively on technical specifications. John Deere's compact loaders are similarly capable, offering features and performance that match or exceed Bobcat in many categories. But neither company can overcome the fundamental disadvantage of entering the market decades late. Bobcat established the category, defined customer expectations, built the dealer and service infrastructure, and created brand associations that persist regardless of technical parity. When contractors think compact equipment, they think Bobcat first, even if they ultimately buy a competitor. That brand position, built over 60 years of market leadership, is nearly impossible to displace no matter how much Caterpillar and John Deere invest. The construction equipment rental industry provides the clearest evidence of Bobcat's enduring dominance. Rental companies stock equipment based on what customers request most frequently. Walk into any United Rentals, Sunbelt Rentals, or Herc Rentals location and count the compact loaders in the yard. Bobcats typically outnumber Caterpillar and John Deere compact equipment combined. Not because rental companies prefer Bobcat, but because that's what contractors specifically request when they call. "I need a Bobcat for the weekend" is the common phrasing, even though the rental company might send a different brand. The genericization of the Bobcat name, like Kleenex for tissues or Xerox for copiers, represents brand value that can't be purchased with marketing budgets. It's earned through decades of being the default choice. Every year, Caterpillar holds strategy meetings where executives discuss how to increase market share in compact equipment. Every year, John Deere convenes similar discussions. They analyze customer preferences, study competitor strategies, develop new products with innovative features, and invest millions in marketing campaigns. And every year, Bobcat maintains market leadership, not through dramatically superior technology, but through the accumulated advantages of 6 decades as the category leader. The market that was supposedly too small to matter in 1960 is now large enough that even second and third place generate billions in revenue. But first place, the position Caterpillar and John Deere could have owned if they'd listened to 2 turkey farmers, belongs to Bobcat, and it's not changing. The human cost of the rejection deserves mention too. Eddie Keller died in 1995, having seen his invention revolutionize multiple industries and generate billions in sales. Cyril Keller lived until 2008, long enough to see Bobcat's complete domination of compact equipment worldwide. The Melrose brothers built a manufacturing empire that was eventually acquired by larger companies but retained the Bobcat brand because it was more valuable than any corporate name. The executives who dismissed the Kellers at Caterpillar and John Deere in 1960 are long retired or deceased, but their decisions echo through decades of lost revenue and missed opportunity. Business history remembers the innovators who succeeded and the executives who failed to recognize innovation when it was demonstrated directly to them. Today, if you visit Rothsay, Minnesota, population still around 800, you'll find a small monument acknowledging the Keller brothers' invention. It's modest, understated, very Midwestern. Exactly what you'd expect from a community that produced turkey farmers who changed industrial history. There's no massive museum, no corporate headquarters, no sprawling campus celebrating the invention. Just a small marker noting that this tiny town was where the compact equipment revolution began, where two brothers refused to accept that problems were unsolvable, and where the giants of industry made the most expensive mistake of their corporate lives. $8 billion annually. That's what way too small actually meant. From a turkey farm in Rothsay, Minnesota, to global industrial dominance generating $8 billion annually, the Bobcat story teaches lessons that extend far beyond construction equipment. This isn't just a tale of two brothers who invented a machine. This is a masterclass in how the biggest opportunities often come in the smallest packages, how conventional wisdom can blind even the most successful companies to revolutionary change, and how refusing to accept that problems are unsolvable can create industries that didn't exist before. The Keller brothers proved something that Caterpillar and John Deere learned too late. Innovation doesn't require corporate research budgets or prestigious engineering degrees. Sometimes it just requires people desperate enough to solve their own problems and stubborn enough to keep trying when everyone says it's impossible. The fundamental mistake that Caterpillar and John Deere made wasn't technical, it was philosophical. They believed that their understanding of the equipment market was complete, that their decades of experience gave them perfect knowledge of what customers needed, and that anything outside their existing product categories wasn't worth pursuing. This is the trap that catches successful companies repeatedly throughout business history. Success breeds confidence, confidence becomes certainty, and certainty makes you blind to change. When you've spent 50 years building bigger and more powerful equipment, when that strategy has made you billions of dollars and established you as an industry leader, the suggestion that smaller might sometimes be better seems not just wrong but fundamentally absurd. The executives who dismissed the Kellers weren't stupid or lazy, they were victims of their own success. But here's the cruel irony that makes this story so instructive. The very qualities that made Caterpillar and John Deere successful, their focus on power, their commitment to quality in heavy equipment, their dominance in large-scale earthmoving, are exactly what blinded them to compact equipment's potential. They were so good at what they did, so completely dominant in their traditional markets, that they couldn't see value in equipment that violated their core assumptions. Compact loaders weren't just smaller versions of their products. They were fundamentally different tools designed for different work. Understanding that required letting go of assumptions that had served brilliantly for decades. Most companies can't do that. Most companies defend their assumptions until competitors make them irrelevant. The Keller brothers had advantages that Caterpillar lacked, despite Caterpillar's vastly superior resources. They had direct experience with the problem they were solving. Eddie's back was breaking from manual labor that existing equipment couldn't address. They had no preconceptions about what equipment should look like or how it should operate. They had the desperate necessity that comes from knowing that finding a solution meant the difference between continuing to farm or being forced out by injury. And crucially, they had nothing to lose by thinking differently because they weren't defending an existing market position. Innovation is often easier for outsiders because they're not burdened by the assumptions and commitments that constrain established players. Every time a Caterpillar executive sees a Bobcat skid steer on a construction site, and they see them constantly because Bobcats are everywhere, it's a reminder of the $8 billion lesson. The machine that was too small to matter is now essential to modern construction. The market that didn't exist is now larger than many companies' entire revenue. The turkey farmers who were dismissed as amateurs built an empire while the industrial giants watched and then scrambled to catch up. And the most painful part? Caterpillar's own compact equipment division is now profitable and important to their business, proving that if they'd partnered with the Kellers in 1960 instead of dismissing them, they would have owned the market they're now fighting to compete in. The decision that seemed so obviously correct was catastrophically wrong, and the evidence of that mistake is visible on every job site worldwide. The compact equipment revolution didn't just create Bobcat, it validated an approach to innovation that challenges conventional corporate wisdom. The Kellers didn't conduct market research, hire consultants, or develop 5-year strategic plans. They built something that solved their problem and assumed others had similar problems. They were right. The market existed. It was just invisible to companies that defined markets by their existing products rather than by unsolved customer problems. This is the fundamental difference between product-driven and problem-driven innovation. Caterpillar was product-driven. They built better versions of equipment categories they already understood. The Kellers were problem-driven. They built whatever was necessary to solve the problem, regardless of whether it fit existing categories. Problem-driven innovation creates new markets. Product-driven innovation competes in existing ones. The story resonates today because it keeps happening. Established companies with vast resources and deep expertise repeatedly miss innovations that seem obvious in retrospect. Kodak invented the digital camera but dismissed it because it threatened film sales. Blockbuster rejected Netflix's partnership offer because streaming seemed like a niche market. Nokia dominated mobile phones but missed the smartphone revolution. The pattern is consistent. Success creates assumptions, assumptions create blindness, and blindness creates opportunities for outsiders who aren't constrained by conventional wisdom. The Keller brothers are part of a long tradition of innovators who succeeded precisely because they didn't know enough to understand why their ideas shouldn't work. If you've made it this far in this story, you understand something crucial about innovation, about opportunity, and about how individuals with vision can reshape entire industries. The stories we tell at Motor Chronicles aren't just corporate histories. They're lessons about persistence, about challenging assumptions, and about recognizing that the biggest mistakes often look like the safest decisions at the time. If these kinds of stories resonate with you, if you want to understand the real history behind the machines and companies that built our world, then subscribe to Motor Chronicles now. We're uncovering the truths that official company histories gloss over, the billion-dollar mistakes that business schools analyze, and the remarkable human stories behind industrial empires. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that appreciates the drama, irony, and inspiration in how innovation actually happens. 65 years after Eddie and Cyril Keller were told their machine was too small to matter, Bobcat equipment works on virtually every construction site, farm, and facility maintenance operation worldwide. The distinctive white and red machines, the colors changed from the original white, but the brand recognition remained absolute, are as ubiquitous as the yellow Caterpillar equipment that dismissed them. The compact equipment market generates $8 billion annually and continues growing as applications expand. And somewhere in Rothsay, Minnesota, population still hovering around 800, there's a small monument to two turkey farmers who refused to accept that their backs had to break, who kept building and testing and failing until they succeeded, and who proved that the giants of industry can miss what's right in front of them when they're too successful to question their assumptions. That's the legacy of thinking small. Sometimes the biggest revolutions come in the smallest packages, and the company's too proud to see it pay the price forever.